Fuji Cherry, Kojo no Mai make absolutely fantastic DIY bonsai. And today I'm super excited because I'm going to start one from absolute scratch. I picked it up from a garden centre, so let's dive in. I'm Darren and this is Tiny Tree Tuesday. It's the bonsai show where I sit down with one of my trees and I'll talk you through the process of what I'm doing and why. Before I do any work on the tree, I like to have a look at the base of the trunk to see what surface roots or nabari we've got to work with, as that's a very important part of the design. It's pivotal, in fact, so it pays to start there because it might inform our decisions later. I'm just brushing off any loose stuff. It's just a bit quicker with the hands initially, as long as you don't break any roots. But now I'm going to come in with a chopstick. I'm just going to very carefully pull back the soil. I've got a very soft grip on the chopstick. I don't want to rip any of these roots because it's not really a good time of the year to be doing any kind of root damage. These kojos root very easily from cutting, and I think that's how they're propagated for the garden industry. And so you almost always do have somewhat of a nice spreading base. It's always worth looking for. It might not be perfect, but there's always going to be something, just by virtue of the way that the roots form from a cutting. In terms of selecting this material, I chose it because it was the thickest trunk for a start off. It's got a little bit of movement to it, nice little bit of wiggle, plenty of branches low down, but I will be creating a more in-depth video dedicated to choosing material for DIY bonsai. It's going to be really in-depth. I'm going to go ham on it. It's something that I'm working on literally now. Probably in the next couple of weeks or so it'll be ready. Okay, so we've got some good structure down here. The roots coming this way. Got some thicker roots coming up this way as well, off towards the back here, that you can just about make out coming down here. This one might not stay long term, but it just emphasises the fact that we've got a very good spread of roots here. And we've also got that piece coming down that way towards the camera, if you can see it, just in here. Around this side, we've got numerous roots coming from here. There might be something thicker and more structural underneath some of these finer pieces, but there's enough to tell me that there's plenty of structural roots around here. With the nabari uncovered, next on the list is to do a bit of cleaning, and that is going to consist of removing of dead branches. Both of these branches are dead, so I'm going to remove those back to the nearest living piece. I'll leave a bit of a stub for now. I just want to reveal enough of the structure to get on with designing the tree. Another task during cleaning is to identify any branches that are definitely not necessary. So I'm looking at very weak interior pieces. So if there's any new young shoots or weak shaded out pieces that are right next to some more established branches, I'll remove those weak ones. If they're in a big open space and I think, well, maybe a branch there might be useful, I'll leave them on. So here we've got two much more established branches, and in and amongst them there are some younger shoots that have popped up adventitiously. I'll just remove those younger ones because these more established pieces are much more usable. And the same with this little piece here. We've got a thicker piece above it and we've got something nearby to use, so that can also get removed. So we've got two thicker pieces here with some buds quite close in. If I use these thicker pieces in the design, I'm not going to need those buds. And if I want to cut these thicker pieces off, I won't cut back to the buds. It'll just look weird with a thick stump and a tiny little bud on the end. So I'll remove these buds, just pinching them off like that. That's revealed a bit more of the structure. In here we've got another candidate for removal. This bud is in the crotch of two branches. So whatever happens, I'm going to use one of those branches. I'll never use that tiny little bud that's in the crotch. And crotch growth also contributes to inverse taper, you see. There's also a couple of shoots on the underside of branches, so I'll just pull those off. Being on the underside, they'll be shaded out by definition, so they'll always be a bit weak. The bark down here is yellow, and it also appears that the trunk's slightly thinner. It's nothing to worry about. The tree will produce proper bark in time. When it realises it needs to protect itself, it'll blend in and look normal, thicken up a bit as well. Okay, with the cleaning out of the way, I can now look around the tree, look at the base, look at the trunk, any potential features that the tree might have. Try and come up with a preferred viewing angle that's going to give us a basis for coming up with a design for the tree. When I'm choosing the front, I'm going to look at which side does the base look its most stable, which, you know, does it have a good distribution of roots, some front to back depth. And then as I follow up the trunk, I'm looking for nice, any, you know, changes of direction, any bends, keeping an eye out for any inverse taper that might need to be disguised or minimised. And although it doesn't apply to this tree, I'd also be looking for any deadwood features that the tree might have, such as any interesting hollows, or perhaps any scars that don't add any value to the tree that we might want to prefer pushing to the back of the tree out of sight. Right, first though, let's see if we can identify a good viewing angle of that nabari, or trunk base, the spread of roots. So as I mentioned earlier, the nabari does have a gap here. So it might be that I want to push that towards the back of the tree. So around here, that's the best viewing angle for the nabari. I'll just show you in up close. So somewhere in here, it appears to be its widest point. We've got some structural roots coming towards the viewer. We've got some structural roots coming towards the back, off to the side. You know, it's just a nice distribution as well. The trunk is tapering reasonably nicely. Around the back we do have some structural pieces, but we've got a big gap in the nabari here. The trunk doesn't appear quite as flared on this side. The distribution of roots just isn't quite as good. I think you could probably use either of those sides really. Like I mentioned though, the nabari isn't the only feature. We also want to look at the trunk line. So I'll look at the movement of the trunk and keep an eye out for any inverse taper or other issues. So from this angle, the movement of the trunk is all in one plane, so it appears pretty straight. And at this side, where the nabari isn't so good, there is some nice movement. You know, we could choose this as the trunk line for some side to side and some forwards and backwards movement, or we can continue the trunk up here and it comes off in this direction and then goes back up. So there is some, you know, there's some potential on this side. Obviously the tree doesn't have any deadwood features, so that's not coming into it. But in terms of just pure flow and movement, there is some potential here. As we continue around the tree, this is just the opposite side where the trunk appeared pretty straight in the plane that we're looking at it from. From the viewing angle where the nabari was pretty good, we've got numerous potential trunk leaders that we can use, all of which change direction. This one comes off this way, this one comes off that way, and this one comes up a bit higher and then goes in a different direction. So I think, like, just out of pure luck, the best viewing angle for the nabari is also the best viewing angle for the trunk line. So that makes choosing the front really easy this time. It doesn't always work out like that. Usually you have to sort of compromise between the nabari and the trunk, you know, find an angle that maximises both of those features. Let's pick and define the actual trunk line from the base all the way up to the top. And so we do have some options in that regard. I don't really want to create a tree that's pretty two-dimensional, so I don't want the movement to all be just sort of snaking in one direction. We want to sort of come up and then forwards a bit, or maybe backwards a bit and off to the side again. We don't want it all just in one two-dimensional plane. They all have merits. So if we follow the trunk up here, we could come up in this direction to use this branch here. The trunk would come up and then change direction here. So using this as our trunk line, it has the advantage of being almost perpendicular. We've got a nice bit of movement here in the lower trunk, sort of got a nice curve there. And then this, instead of remaining in the same plane of that curve, it comes off perpendicular. Then again it divides into two, going in a different direction. So that's, you know, that's got some nice three-dimensional movement to it, that. And I think if I cut back to this piece as our trunk leader, that's going to leave a bit of an awkward transition of taper there. You know, it's going to come up and then thoof, that way, from pretty thick to thin, and there is a bit of inverse taper here as well. And if this is our preferred front for the base, the nabari, that means the trunk's coming away, so we're always going to have like that inverse taper right in our face. And then there's another option to follow the trunk upwards. You know, there's a bit of movement, and then we come all the way up, and then the movement comes off forwards a little bit. Can you see that? Instead of just being all in one plane, it sort of comes towards the viewer a little bit and comes up in this direction, and then we could use that as the trunk, or that as the trunk, or we could even go really tall up here. We've just got a very straight taperless section between here and here, so I'm not thrilled about that. And then there's a third option as well, so following up, then it changes up, then it kicks out here to this piece. And if I use this piece, however, as the trunk line, that does mean that we've got some movement here and a change in taper here, which is a bit lower. It breaks up the monotony of this straight section that we'd have otherwise. I haven't made a decision, but one thing I do know is I'm not going to use this section here ever in any design. So I'm going to go ahead and just make that decision now. I do it just a flat saw cut across just to get it out of the way. So I've cut well outside the shoulder. I won't clean and dress it just yet, just in case I end up removing more. But before the end of the video, it's really important to seal this because these are susceptible to fungal issues. It's really important to seal any cuts. Right, now that I've done that cut, it's become absolutely obvious to me what I should do. I just really like the fact that we've got a change in direction here. We've got a branch with a change in direction here. There's a little bit of a jog just in here as well. So even this piece kicks out a bit. I'm going to go with this for the trunk line, and it can come up, or it can come up this way, it can come up this way. Yeah, that's the trunk line. Now that I've made that decision, I've got a knock-on choice to make, and that's what do I do in this area? Do I keep this thicker piece that's almost like a sub trunk, or do I choose a branch to use out of these two and grow those out as primary branches? There we go, got a little marker there. I make that the front. Just thought I'd mention, I'm thinking about incorporating a viewer's question into this weekly show. So if you've got any questions, drop me a comment down below and I'll incorporate it into the next episode. So I've got to do something here because we have got inverse taper forming there. The decision I've made is that I'm going to remove this thick piece, and then I'm going to use this branch to disguise the inverse taper by positioning it carefully, and then any secondaries that form, just to obscure that inverse taper from view. I'm not looking to like completely cover it up, just use a bit of careful branch placement to draw our eye through the inverse taper rather than making it glaringly obvious. I cut outside of that shoulder, seal it, and then when the tree has adjusted its tissue, I will come back at a later date and dress the wound in such a way that it'll heal in a more aesthetically pleasing manner. So there's just a little bit of almost like a collar around this branch between the trunk and the branch itself. That's the shoulder, and if I were to cut this shoulder out, I'd have to make a big gouge into the trunk, whereas if I cut the branch outside of that shoulder, it's going to be a much smaller wound. It's just the safer cut to make. Even though it does leave a protrusion on the trunk, it's the right thing to do. So yeah, this ring of bark around here, that's what I would have had to cut out to remove the shoulder. The whole protrusion that I'm tracking with the point of the shears there, that's how big the wound would have been in the trunk. There's a bit of a bulge in the trunk here as a result of not removing that shoulder, but you've got to play it safe. You don't want to lose your tree after all this work. Right, as I said, it's super important to dress the cuts, particularly on this species, because they are prone to fungal issues such as silver leaf. I know someone who's lost a Kojo no Mai to silver leaf. Create that just really clean cut instead of the almost crushing action of the branch cutters. And then to seal it, I'm going to use this. I prefer this for deciduous species because the deciduous trees are less sappy than conifers. I find that as the healing progresses, it pushes the cut paste off the tree, and also I've got a problem with a certain type of bee that collects it to make their nests. I can't remember which type it is, so they keep pinching it basically. They don't do it with this, so it's kind of a double whammy. I haven't treated this little stump yet, have I? There's almost like a shoulder that's formed all the way back down to this branch. There's just a very slight ridge just along here, and just a bit darker on the right as the light catches it. So I suspect this has died back and the tree's adjusted its vascular tissue to suit. That's just really going to work out in our favour. Let's investigate how far along we can get before we see any green. I suspect that it's going to be somewhere around here. I'll just work my way around. Ah, there we go. There's just a little spot of green. Just there. There's just a little nick of green. Oh, this is really exciting. Ah, there we go. So we found another bit there. So we can sort of get an idea that the live vein, if you like, is somewhere around that bit. Just joining the dots now. And along this edge, it goes all the way back to here. Look, I finally managed to find where it tracks back to. If I'd have noticed that from the start, I might have made some very different decisions, but it is what it is, so let's make the best of it. There we go. Now that I know that we've got some dieback going on, I'm going to keep this branch because that's going to hopefully prevent any further dieback, promote a bit of healing, maybe. But if it shows signs of creating a shoulder and swelling, I will have to remove that. I'm toying with the idea of pushing the planting angle off to this side, just to the extent where this section here is no longer dead vertical. Just want to go just... There we go, I think it's vertical there, so if you just go a little bit beyond that, I'll prop it up at this angle. Yeah, so that pushes the trunk way off into this side. It evens out the base a bit though, that looks a bit more even, and it also means that we have a bit more movement coming out of the ground. You know, instead of being almost upright, it's now leaning, and it comes back a bit. This isn't vertical, and it leans right off here. I kind of like that angle change actually. The trunk isn't very thick. It's not the thickest of trunks, and it's got a bit of movement to it. You know, it's quite graceful. And it's not tapering really strongly. It's tapering gradually. So all of those factors are leaning me more towards more of an elegant feel. And I think having the apex of the tree somewhere over here, far away from the base, I think really draws on that aesthetic of the elegant tree. It's sort of, it's so elegant, it's able to lean all the way over in this direction without falling over. Right, so I really need to decide which of these pieces that I'm going to keep as the trunk leader. I'm going to cut this front piece off. This is much more flexible. I can get a bit of movement into this, but it's a pretty boring piece of movement. It just kind of predictably has the same degree of curve as the section below it, and it just gradually gets towards the sky. I could use this to create a bit more interest, but it's never going to have the taper, whereas this is a bit, the back piece here is much thinner, more flexible, and it's got more ramification as well, and better taper. So I've made the decision. I'm going to cut this bit off here. I'm using the saw again because I don't want to damage my cutters. I need bigger cutters. There we go. And then let's just clean that up. Right, I'm going to go with some pretty beefy aluminium wire. Because I want to wire this trunk and I've got nothing else structural to wire, to anchor the wire to, I'm going to go into the soil and I'll go in that gap in the nabari. Where is it? There it is. It's really hollow down there. Right, go next to it, that's a bit firmer. And with this thin bark down here, it's really important that I don't let the wire slip. So I'm supporting it with my offhand. As you wind it, it can continue to tighten. So I've got to support it with my offhand really well so it doesn't drag along this thin, delicate bark and the wounds. When I hit the underside of that shoulder, that's good. Try and miss the top edge of that wound. Tweak a couple of these leaves out of the way. I don't want to rip the bud off, but I do want to move the leaves out of the way because they're going to get crushed otherwise. On the back of this piece, And I start to wonder how far up I'm going to carry this wire. Which begs the question, how tall do I want this tree to be? Okay, right, I'm not going to take the wire any further. Let's see about getting the movement that we want into this trunk. So I think if I try and bring it down and back slightly, that's going to enhance the movement at this location. So come down. I wonder if we can take it just a bit lower. Just going to keep an eye on the bark there. And these are a bit brittle. Right, I'm going to stop there. Just between my shears there, the bark has started to crack. So I'm going to stop with the bend there. Focus the movement a little bit further up. Just watching. Another tip is to not make bends in a single plane, but actually to rotate with the turn of the wire. And I've put the wire on with the rotation of the wire strategically to allow me to do this bend, but I'm actually twisting as well as bending. I'm watching all along the outside for any nicks and tears, so I'm starting to see tears now. I'm just conscious that I've created a vertical line. I'm just going to readjust this section here. And the pressure I'm putting is right at the shoulder, so I've got to be careful. Right, I've broken a branch doing that. That's a shame. That movement's looking better. I'm much happier with that. Right, another little tear there. Oh, really pushing that to the limit, I think. There we go, 1 or 2 more turns further. Just lift these out so you can kind of see what the trunk's doing now, I guess, maybe. Right, this piece, I'm only keeping it really in case of dieback while we're healing this, so I'm just going to cut it back. I don't actually see a place for this in the design coming from the inside of that bend. Okay, something came up with the family yesterday, so I had to pack the soil back in and put it back in its pot. But to make it easier to see what we're doing today, I've just cut the pot down to the soil level. And the last job that I need to do is get some movement into these branches, get them positioned nicely to sort of finalise the initial design that we've done. So in here we've got a piece of structural wire, and there's a gap underneath the wire that I can poke this piece of wire through. That's going to give it stability and support, so I don't have to wire it in tandem with another branch. What do you know, it's just a bit snug. But because I'm butting up against deadwood, I'm not too worried about doing any damage to it. Okay, so I've got that wire tucked under there through that gap, and then I'm going to follow this structural wire around to give it support, and then come just across. Get that wire locked into position. Miss out that bud, and then we're plain sailing. Okay, and then, so the first move at the shoulder, I want to come up and backwards slightly. Then come back down and forwards. And then I'm just trying to create some pretty random movement in this branch there. Alright, that feels like some pretty nice quirky movement. I think it's going to nicely disguise this inverse taper. So I'm just going to trim off the excess wire there, and we'll prune back to a couple of buds on the end there. And I've left it quite long because we've got quite a long flowing trunk. And I think on this piece I'm just going to knock it back to 2 buds. I'm just going to impart just a little bit of a final twist. There we go. So the movement's, you know, random. It's not just a continuous predictable flow. It's a bit up, down, left, right, twist, gentle curve, tight curve. Oh, it's a bit warmer today, and we had some rain last night and it's gone super muggy in true UK fashion. So the next move I'm going to make will be to wire this branch, and I'll track the wire all the way up the trunk and wire it in tandem with this branch up here. Being careful not to trap the foliage as I go. They're not the easiest of trees to wire because they've got a slightly zigzagging pattern. And if your rhythm slightly deviates from the frequency of that zigzag, you're kind of fighting against it. Let's just come up and then out. Cool. Just trying to make like a nice funky branch, really. Yep, so I've kind of brought it upwards and backwards for a bit of rear depth, but also to try and fill in some of this empty space around here. So I'll wire this branch and this branch in tandem now. Okay, so it's already fairly tight into the trunk, so I'm going to come out from the trunk. There it is. Really just embracing the crazy with these branches. I'm not looking to do anything too contrived, but at the same time I don't want anything too predictable. Yes. Oh, I like the lines on that. Yeah. Just trim back this structural piece of wire. And then this. I like that a lot. So with these big leaves, it feels quite heavy. We'll lighten that up a bit as time goes by. I might just play with this back branch a little bit. There we go. This won't always feel so bulky, I guess. And I've got a feeling that this branch might eventually go, but I'll keep it here now to, you know, give the tree a little bit of extra ramification. You know, I don't want to cut all the branches off and have it just look like a stick in a pot the whole time. You know, having it there, I think, just gives a little bit of interest, bit of, you know, different movement with it going down and then out and then back up. A pretty humble Fuji cherry, off to what I think is a pretty good start. I'm happy with it, and that's all that matters. Although I do just wonder what would happen if I just very carefully... There we go, I've just tweaked that apex just a little bit further, just not quite so far forward, just a tiny bit further out. And I've also made this curve look slightly less like it was going to cross itself from the front. And then, you know, I've got some pretty dynamic movement in that trunk section now. Perfect.